An entire career built around a single haunting question. What does justice actually owe someone who violates the trust of a family, a community, an institution? He devoted his scholarship to mercy. He devoted it to retribution. He devoted it to studying the lengths a family will travel to shield its own. Not once did it occur to him that his research would become his eulogy. On an unremarkable Friday morning in a leafy Tallahassee subdivision, a criminal law professor settled into the driver's seat of his own car, parked inside his own garage, his body still flushed from a recent workout, his mind occupied with nothing more sinister than the afternoon pickup at his son's preschool. He had absolutely no awareness that a pair of hired strangers had been tracking his movements for weeks. He had no way of knowing that the architects behind his impending murder weren't distant enemies, but people bound to him through marriage, through family dinners, through a decade of shared holidays. This is the account of Dan Markel, a father who poured himself completely into his children, a marriage that disintegrated into open warfare, and a homicide investigation that would consume more than 10 years, produce 5 separate criminal convictions, and expose one of the most calculated family betrayals ever prosecuted in an American courtroom. Daniel Eric Markel entered the world in Montreal during October of 1972, though he came of age just across the border in Toronto, inside a Jewish household that would leave an indelible imprint on his worldview. Acquaintances from his early years remember a mind that never seemed to slow down, restless, hungry, always chasing the next intellectual challenge. That drive carried him to Harvard for his undergraduate studies, then overseas to Israel for a stretch of academic work, followed by graduate coursework at Cambridge, before he circled back to Harvard to complete his law degree. By 2005, that trajectory had deposited him at Florida State University's College of Law, where he built a reputation as a formidable, uncompromising, and widely admired authority on criminal justice theory. Colleagues painted a picture of a man perpetually producing scholarship, nurturing junior faculty, and cultivating a vast web of professional relationships. But none of that academic pedigree is what ultimately shapes this narrative. What matters is the moment he crossed paths with a woman named Wendy. Their connection began on JDate, a matchmaking platform built around shared Jewish heritage. Wendy Jill Adelson hailed from a well-off, tightly knit family based in South Florida. Her father Harvey and her brother Charlie both practiced dentistry within the same family-run office, while her mother Donna functioned as the household's emotional gravitational center, embedded intensely, at times suffocatingly, in every decision her children ever made. Wendy herself carried an impressive academic resume of her own, holding degrees from Brandeis and Cambridge alongside a law degree from the University of Miami, and had built a career spanning immigration advocacy, teaching, and legal writing. But the Adelsons weren't simply a close family in the conventional sense. Witnesses who would later take the stand described something closer to an insular fortress, a unit where nothing of consequence happened without first passing through Donna's approval. Dan and Wendy exchanged vows in Boca Raton on the 26th of February 2006. Shortly afterward, fate placed them both on the faculty at Florida State's law school, meaning they shared not just a home, but an entire ecosystem, colleagues, campus life, social circles, all overlapping completely. From the outside, observers viewed it as an obvious match, two brilliant, driven individuals who understood one another on a fundamental level. 2 sons followed, arriving in 2009 and 2010, and for a stretch of time, the family projected the image of an aspirational, academic power couple raising children inside a close-knit college town. Dan approached fatherhood with the same relentless energy he brought to his scholarship. He became a fixture at his boys' preschool, dropping by for lunch several times weekly, reading aloud to the class, and enthusiastically participating in lessons about Jewish traditions and holidays. Coworkers recalled how his entire demeanor shifted whenever his sons wandered into his office, beaming as he showed off their crayon drawings to anyone within earshot. Even on the road for work, he never skipped his nightly phone call to tuck them in verbally. Whatever turmoil simmered beneath the surface of his marriage, his children remained unmistakably the anchor of his emotional world. That same relentless intensity, however, wasn't without its downside. Dan confronted conflict directly, whether the dispute concerned constitutional law or something deeply personal, and he wasn't inclined to retreat from an argument or dilute his convictions simply to preserve harmony. Traits like these thrived in an academic setting or a legal debate, but inside a marriage already showing strain, they likely made finding middle ground nearly impossible. Beneath the polished surface, cracks were widening. Wendy would later characterize the relationship as isolating, expressing that she never felt like an equal within the partnership. Dan, meanwhile, carried that same directness and intensity into his domestic life, and court records, along with statements from friends, would eventually reveal a relationship that had been quietly deteriorating long before outsiders grasped just how fractured things had become. Neither party ever offered a complete public explanation of what unraveled between them privately, yet the competing narratives that emerged, his framed around a father fighting to remain present, hers framed around escaping an unequal dynamic, would go on to fuel years of contentious legal battles. Everything came crashing down on the 10th of September 2012. While Dan traveled for a professional obligation, Wendy quietly filed for divorce. He returned home to discover an empty house. Wendy had already relocated with their sons, taking a significant portion of the furniture with her, leaving nothing behind except divorce paperwork waiting for his discovery. There had been no discussion beforehand, no forewarning, no attempt at a mutual conversation to process how the marriage had reached its breaking point. He absorbed the reality of his marriage's collapse simply by walking through the door of a house that had been stripped bare in his absence. The way the separation unfolded set the tone for everything that followed, transforming what could have remained a difficult yet civil parting into an outright legal battle, one destined to stretch across years and eventually entangle nearly every relative on both sides. The marriage officially ended on the 31st of July 2013, with the court granting both parents joint custody. But that ruling didn't close the chapter. It merely opened a far longer and considerably darker one. Beyond simply determining where the children would primarily reside, the legal proceedings dragged through arguments over finances, accusations of hidden assets, disputes over the division of belongings, even conflict surrounding a family heirloom ring. The two sides clashed over communication protocols, over what each parent said about the other within earshot of the boys, and over exactly how much authority Donna should be permitted in the children's routine upbringing. It was precisely the kind of exhausting, detail-obsessed litigation that gradually transforms two former partners into bitter opponents incapable of agreeing on virtually anything. Wendy pushed to relocate the boys nearly 500 miles north to south, back to South Florida, positioning herself near her parents and brothers where she'd have an established family support network. For Dan, this proposal directly threatened the single, non-negotiable priority in his life, remaining a constant, hands-on presence for his sons. School runs, weeknight dinners, the everyday rituals of fatherhood simply couldn't survive that kind of geographic distance. He challenged the relocation request in court with the same ferocity he applied to every aspect of his existence. On the 20th of June 2013, the judge ruled in his favor. The relocation petition was denied. Dan had prevailed, securing his ability to remain as deeply involved in his sons' lives as he'd always been. For the Adelson family, though, that court decision wasn't experienced as simply losing a legal argument, it registered as an unacceptable defeat. That loss landed particularly hard on Wendy's mother, Donna. According to emails later entered into evidence, Donna spoke about Dan using extraordinarily venomous language, and she began advocating for increasingly extreme strategies aimed at overturning the court's decision. Every account, from people both inside and outside the family circle, confirmed that she operated as the emotional nucleus of the Adelsons, the figure whose opinions, expectations, and directives the entire family structure revolved around. The prospect of losing regular access to her daughter and grandsons wasn't something she seemed capable of simply accepting and moving forward from. At one point, evidence showed Donna floated the idea of offering Dan a payment of roughly $1 million, pooled from multiple family members, in exchange for permission to relocate the children. Dan flatly rejected the proposal. His son's daily presence in his life wasn't something available for purchase at any figure. A separate scheme that surfaced during evidentiary review involved Wendy allegedly considering lying to Dan, telling him the boys were secretly being raised in the Christian faith, apparently intended to weaponize his deep attachment to their Jewish upbringing and manipulate him into abandoning his legal objections out of sheer emotional devastation. Wendy would later testify under oath that she never actually followed through on that particular plan. By early 2014, tensions had climbed to an entirely new level, and this time, Dan was the one initiating legal action. He petitioned the court to limit Donna's unsupervised time with his sons, alleging she had disparaged him directly in front of the children. A hearing on that motion was set for the 15th of May, 2014, but it was pushed back and ultimately never adjudicated. For Donna, this represented far more than a routine legal disagreement. Her bond with her grandsons formed the core of her existence, and now that connection itself faced formal restriction, layered atop the relocation defeat she'd already suffered months prior. In less than 12 months, she had gone from anticipating her daughter and grandchildren moving nearby to losing that battle outright, to confronting the very real possibility of losing unsupervised access to the boys entirely. By summer 2014, whatever internal family conversations had taken place regarding the relocation defeat and this fresh threat to Donna's access had crossed the line from mere discussion into concrete, deadly planning. The connective thread linking the polished, comfortable world of the Adelson family to the criminal underworld of contract killing ran through a woman named Catherine Magbanua, someone romantically involved with Wendy's brother Charlie, and simultaneously the mother of children fathered by a man named Sigfredo Garcia. That single, overlapping relationship was all it took to bridge a respectable South Florida dental dynasty with two men prepared to commit murder for financial compensation. Weeks later, in June 2014, Garcia and an accomplice named Luis Rivera made the drive from South Florida up to Tallahassee, carrying with them a printed photograph of Dan alongside his home address. Their objective was unmistakable: eliminate him. Garcia's link into the Adelson orbit came directly through his relationship with Magbanua, while Rivera, a longtime friend Garcia trusted enough to bring into something this dangerous, came along as an accomplice. During that initial reconnaissance trip, however, they lost sight of their target and were forced to abandon the mission, retreating back to South Florida empty-handed. It was a botched first attempt, and at that point, absolutely no one outside that vehicle had any inkling the plot even existed. Dan continued moving through his everyday routine, completely oblivious to the fact that two men had already driven hundreds of miles with the explicit intention of ending his life. He dropped his sons off at preschool that week, exactly as always, harboring no suspicion whatsoever that danger was looming over him or his family. On the 15th of July 2014, a Toyota Prius was rented out of North Miami. The following day, Garcia and Rivera piloted that same vehicle back toward Tallahassee, rolling into town around midnight, this time armed with far more precise intelligence. Through their connection to Magbanua, they learned Dan had a flight booked to New York the very next day. This meant they had to strike immediately before he departed the city, or risk having the entire operation postponed indefinitely. Whatever window of opportunity remained was rapidly closing, compressing what had been a loosely defined future plan into an urgent, hours-away deadline. Investigators would later determine a total payment of approximately $100,000 had been arranged for carrying out the killing, funneled from Charlie through Magbanua and finally down to Garcia and Rivera, a deliberately constructed financial chain engineered so that no money and no direct communication would ever need to pass between the Adelson family and the men actually committing the murder. On the morning of Friday, the 18th of July 2014, Dan carried out his usual schedule with no awareness of the danger closing in around him. He dropped his sons at preschool, drove to the gym, completed his workout, and began heading home. The exact same sequence of stops he'd repeated hundreds of times before, on a morning indistinguishable from any other. Surveillance footage recovered later, pulled from the gym, city buses, and surrounding businesses, revealed a light green Prius shadowing him throughout that entire morning, maintaining just enough distance to avoid drawing attention while never losing sight of him. Moments before pulling into his own driveway, he was reportedly speaking on the phone, casually mentioning he'd spotted an unfamiliar figure lurking nearby, and the person on the other end of that call then heard sounds consistent with a violent assault unfolding. At roughly 11 in the morning, while Dan remained seated in his vehicle inside the garage of his Benton Hills residence, he was shot twice in the head at point-blank range. Nothing inside the house had been disturbed. His keys remained on his person. There was no staged burglary, no attempted robbery designed to mask the true motive behind the killing. Whoever tracked him that morning had arrived with a singular purpose. The gunman fled in the rented Prius, and according to Rivera's later testimony, Garcia fired the fatal shots while Rivera handled the driving. Dan was discovered critically wounded and rushed to emergency care. A grand jury would later formally condemn a 19-minute delay before paramedics reached the scene, labeling it wholly unacceptable given the severity of his injuries and the urgency required. He succumbed to his wounds on the 19th of July 2014 at just 41 years old, leaving behind two young boys robbed of their father, a grieving family back in Canada blindsided by the revelation that their son and brother had been the deliberate target of an orchestrated conspiracy, and a case destined to require more than a decade, 5 separate criminal trials, and one jaw-dropping family betrayal before the full truth would finally surface. Unraveling this conspiracy and reaching every person responsible would consume over 10 years. For the first 2 years, the investigation hit a wall. Detectives successfully traced the rental Prius and felt reasonably confident they'd identified the two men who pulled the trigger, yet they lacked any solid evidence tying the murder back to anyone within the Adelson family circle. That changed decisively in 2016, when the FBI executed an undercover sting operation. An agent, posing as a figure connected to organized crime in Miami, approached Donna near her residence and demanded payment in exchange for silence regarding the murder. The tactic worked precisely as investigators had hoped. Within minutes, Donna was frantically calling Charlie. Charlie immediately contacted Catherine Magbanua, and Magbanua, in turn, reached out to Garcia, a rapid chain of panicked phone calls that, for the very first time, provided investigators direct evidence linking every level of the conspiracy together into a single, continuous thread. Weeks afterward, the FBI covertly recorded a tense, carefully guarded conversation between Charlie and Magbanua at a restaurant in Miami, a recording so muddled it would require years of audio enhancement before prosecutors could actually use it in court. Garcia was taken into custody in May 2016, with Magbanua's arrest following that October. Rivera, confronted with overwhelming evidence, entered a guilty plea that same October to second-degree murder, agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a 19-year sentence. In 2019, Garcia and Magbanua stood trial together. Jurors convicted Garcia on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy, resulting in a sentence of life plus 30 years. Magbanua's jury, however, failed to reach unanimous agreement, triggering a mistrial. Her case would drag on for years afterward, delayed by pandemic disruptions and continued legal fights over the enhanced restaurant recording, until a new jury finally convicted her in May 2022 on charges of murder, conspiracy, and solicitation, sentencing her to life plus 2 additional 30-year terms. Charlie himself wasn't arrested until April 2022, nearly 8 years after the murder occurred, once the refined audio recording finally gave prosecutors sufficient grounds to move forward with charges. During his trial, his defense claimed he'd never ordered the killing at all, insisting he'd instead been extorted by the very men who committed it and paid them purely out of fear for his own safety. Jurors rejected that argument entirely. In November 2023, he was convicted on all 3 counts and sentenced to life plus 60 years. Merely days following Charlie's conviction, Donna was apprehended at Miami International Airport while attempting to board a one-way flight bound for Vietnam, a nation with no extradition agreement with the United States. Her trial faced further delay in 2024 when her defense attorney withdrew due to a conflict of interest, ultimately not commencing until the summer of 2025. Across 6 days of proceedings, jurors heard testimony from 26 witnesses, among them Rivera, Magbanua, Wendy herself, and even Donna's estranged eldest son, who testified that his own family had displayed a striking lack of curiosity about who was actually responsible for Dan's murder. On the 4th of September 2025, Donna was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation, receiving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, plus an additional consecutive 30-year term. Charlie's convictions were subsequently upheld on appeal in July 2026, while Donna's own appeal remains unresolved. 5 defendants, 5 convictions. More than a decade separating those 2 gunshots in a suburban garage from the final guilty verdict handed down in a courtroom. Examined purely from a technical and forensic standpoint, this investigation stands as a masterclass in how modern prosecutors construct airtight cases despite having virtually zero direct physical evidence tying the masterminds to the actual crime scene. No murder weapon was ever recovered at the shooter's residence. No fingerprint connected the orchestrators directly to the trigger being pulled. Instead, investigators methodically reconstructed the entire timeline using surveillance footage, cellular tower data, and vehicle rental documentation. That rented Toyota Prius emerged as the single most crucial piece of physical evidence in the entire case, tracked through footage captured at a gym, aboard city buses, and inside local businesses, then cross-referenced against cell phone signal data that placed 2 specific individuals in Tallahassee at precisely the necessary hours. Even a seemingly minor mechanical malfunction became valuable. Corroborating evidence, investigators later discovered that a firearm had accidentally discharged inside the rental vehicle during the operation, causing damage to part of the car's interior, a detail specific enough to later validate testimony once a cooperating witness agreed to talk. The financial trail proved just as pivotal as the physical evidence trail. Investigators confirmed the total payment for the murder came to approximately $100,000, delivered partially in cash bundled together using a distinctive stapling technique that matched a habit traced back to one particular suspect. 2 months after the killing, one of the intermediaries began receiving a sequence of consecutively numbered paychecks issued from an entirely unrelated family-owned business, despite there being zero evidence she'd ever actually performed any work corresponding to those payments, a textbook pattern investigators recognized as disguised deferred compensation. Years later, that undercover sting operation constructed to mimic a blackmail scheme triggered a rapid-fire sequence of phone calls between the suspects. And it was specifically the sequence and timing of those calls, more than the actual content spoken during them, that finally handed investigators the missing connective link between the people harboring the motive and the man who physically committed the shooting. It underscores a fundamental truth about complex conspiracy prosecutions. Convictions rarely hinge on discovering one singular, perfect piece of evidence. Instead, they emerge from prosecutors methodically stacking dozens of individually unremarkable facts until the overall pattern becomes impossible to dismiss, even when nearly a decade separates the commission of the crime from the moment charges are finally brought against those who orchestrated it. Viewed through a psychological lens, cases rooted in family conflict tend to follow a predictable emotional trajectory, and this case serves as a nearly perfect illustration of that pattern. A murder conspiracy within a family rarely begins as murder. It typically originates as a comparatively smaller dispute over money, over custody arrangements, over access, that escalates incrementally as each side exhausts its available options. In this instance, the progression moved from a contentious divorce to a lost custody battle to a rejected financial buyout offer to a final legal threat targeting a grandparent's access to her grandchildren. Each successive defeat appears to have intensified the emotional stakes rather than diminishing them, a widely recognized warning sign in high-conflict family disputes that eventually turn violent. Escalation of this magnitude almost never stems from a single triggering event. It accumulates gradually. Born from a mounting series of losses, a person ultimately convinces themselves they can no longer endure. Dan Markel devoted his entire professional life to studying the question of what people truly deserve. In a devastating twist of fate, the very family he married into ultimately decided the answer, for him, was permanent silence.